Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, and this is going to be a session on operationalizing NBS in Indian cities. So we have some esteemed speakers on the panel. Um, I would start with introducing what we really want to talk about in the Indian cities, and then I would move on to introducing a panelist and then discussing on the topic of the day. So, operationalizing nature-based solution. So that is something that I think is the talk everywhere around across the globe, and because the challenges in city are numerous. Urban flooding, for example, it's been happening across different cities in India and recently across the globe as well. And the estimated economic loss and life loss has been humongous. This is just one example of a disaster, and we have many more. And deteriorating air quality, I guess, is top in India's list of disasters. And the effects that it has on health and other infrastructure is humongous. And the other most important thing that urban India is facing is a shortage in water crisis. So this is something that's a sad story across different cities in India. So what is the opportunity that NBS gives us is that we still have a lot of India's infrastructure to be built. So there's humongous opportunity to capitalize on this. I would just start with the case and what do we perceive as NBS? So there are many definitions and ideologies out there on nature-based solutions. So this is our standpoint, which is definitely an integration of the different ideologies out there. But NBS constitutes action that help restore, enhance, preserve, manage natural capital and the entire ecological integrity. NBS approach encompasses techniques to increase, restore natural capital, provide ecosystem benefits, build ecosystem and community resilience, maintain ecological balance, and overall it will help to address climate change, poverty, inclusion, and bring in a resource efficiency. So this is the larger aspect of what we think or the case for NBS that we in WRI are looking to build on. And so from moving on from the case, how NBS definitely becomes integral in our urban planning structure, just an outline of that. So NBS is something that can be easily integrated into our existing grey infrastructure. So it doesn't have to be a new thing, but it just has to be in line with what is already existing. And there are a lot of opportunities for integrating NBS into what we have in the current in cities in India. So this is just an example of what cities in India can do to make them more resilient, water efficient, and also resource efficient. Urban biodiversity can be restored. So these are things that NBS would bring into the grey infrastructure in cities. And again, the solutions that NBS has can be at different scales, and more often than not, Indian cities are focusing on solutions always at a larger scale. But we, through our interventions, want to really promote NBS at multiple scales, from your plot level interventions to your neighborhood level interventions to your city or community level interventions, and not just focusing on just harping on these large scale urban forests and wetlands, but also doing these smaller interventions that could really help human well-being and quality of life in that area. So I'll just move into the key challenges that NBS right now is facing. So one is, I'll start from below. So one is governance hindering innovation in business models. So that is something which is key because that's what we are tackling with cities, that they're engaging these multi-stakeholders, bringing in these newer business model arrangements is extremely difficult. And then there is this pressure on pursuing public-private partnerships. So, and the trade-offs between development, environment, and economics is often a big issue. And then lack of experience in public procurement, and the most important thing is silos. We all function in silos. Interest is there among different stakeholder groups, but there's no immediate integration happening. So it's all standalone projects and it's never integrated. And then path dependency. So NBS definitely, you never know what you put in an NBS now, what the ecosystem is going to provide economically in the future. So cities are often looking at that question because in the mind of cities or decision makers with grey infrastructure, there's some value they're aware of. With NBS, the ecological kind of value is very well known, but what is the economic kind of value and how it's going to be maintained in the long run is something that's really missing. And the biggest thing is focus on capital investment. It's again interrelated to the previous one. So once you invest in a business model, who is going to take ownership, and at the different stages of investment, who's going to pay for it, who's going to maintain it. So that is something that's very challenging for integrating NBS in cities. So this is why in the previous slide, the interventions at multiple levels actually gives us an opportunity, because then we are engaging with different sets of communities, like the local neighborhoods or the ward members or community-based organizations, students, educational institutions. So that gives us a wide arena of people to engage with. Finally, moving on to what we are looking to, through NBS, how are we looking to integrate NBS planning in cities? One is through data-driven decision making, engaging with key stakeholders and building capacities, and integrating NBS in institutional structures. So we really are looking to push this data-driven decision making as an important agenda in our, in engaging cities and to integrate NBS in cities. Just a snapshot of what we have done till now is through our Cities for Forest program, we had a mapathon exercise where we tried to identify the potential sites of restoration, especially we overlay the heat maps and try to understand the heat hotspots and try to get the community's interest, the ward councillors' interest for having plot level interventions in few of the wards in Kochi. So this is a map of Kochi. Similarly, in Mumbai, we try to overlay different. This is a spatiotemporal map of heat, and then also try to understand the different building material used. And it was very evident that communities, especially Dharavi, is 5 degrees hotter than the immediate well-off neighborhood. So this is for the month of October. So these are some of the assessments that we are taking to cities to show them what is actually happening and what is it that they can do at different scales, and not really focus on only urban greening or tree planting drives as the only panacea for climate change. So in pipeline is this, where we are trying to understand the value of trees outside forest and the carbon sequestration capacities of them. So this is at the preliminary stages of data collection assessment, which is happening in Mumbai. Finally, with the second principle on engaging with key stakeholders, these are our main stakeholders whom we want to influence. So the public or the government agencies have a policy and regulatory mechanism that will help influence different mandates. For example, in Kochi, we are trying to develop the city disaster or support in developing the city disaster management plan. So we are trying to influence and have nature-based solution as long-term preparedness and be a part of the city disaster management plan itself. So then the mandate is often then easier to read through, and it's easier for decision makers to take parallels from the mandate for on-ground implementation. Then with private sector, we are just trying to private sector is often looked up for promoting innovation and channeling finance. So that is something they would be one of our key stakeholders. Similarly, NGO and citizens for bolstering action on ground, and academia for evidence-based research and recommendations. So again, in Kochi, for implementation in Kochi, we have been closely working with Kerala Forest Research Institute. So they bring their expertise in species selection, trying to understand what is the best time, best place for planting different species on ground. So these are some of the things that we want to focus on with when we say engaging with stakeholders and building capacities. Finally, integrating NBS in the different institutional structure. So our idea is to give out to the city and the decision makers at the city and the state level. There are already existing policies and schemes and missions out there. And we need not really bring out a new mandate, but just embed in the existing mandate nature-based solution as an amendment to the existing mandate. So something key right now that's happening across a few cities in India is integrating blue-green into their master plans. For example, it's happening in Bhopal, Delhi, Madurai, and a few other cities. So even through the Mumbai Climate Action Plan, we are pushing urban greening and biodiversity action track to incorporate nature-based solutions into the city planning processes. But this is just an outline of what can be integrated into the existing structure without having to create something new. And something that came up in Kerala, which is very interesting, is that 1% flood cess, which was imposed after the 2018 floods to rebuild projects and develop future preparedness. So things like this is something that we really need to focus our energies on to bring strategic change and to integrate NBS. having said that, though in India a lot of cities work in, there are NBS associated implementation in a lot of cities. It's mostly standalone projects, but these are some remarkable examples. Like on the top left, you have the East Kolkata wetland, which stands as an example of how it kind of filters almost the dirty water from the city, and also provides an ecosystem, and it's also a thriving kind of biodiversity hotspot. And then on to the right, you have the Vajre forest in Pune, which is thriving in between like the really concrete jungle. And then you have the Khumbarwadi Basin, which is there near Kolhapur, and it is a community associated kind of engagement where the community and the different NGO groups are working together to provide to provide livelihoods for different people. And finally, something that's very close to, I think, most ecologists, environment ecologists, is the sacred groves that is spread across India. So that is something that we should really focus on as NBS, because sacred groves are just an example of what we call and promote as urban forests now. So people would just leave these pristine forests to be. So moving on to how are we bringing this to the platform and to the world outside is through the Cities for Forest initiative. So the Cities for Forest initiative has globally 65 plus cities. Kochi is one of the founding members. We have Hyderabad and Mumbai on board, and we focus across three different scales. One is the inner forest, nearby forest, and faraway forest region, and the primary idea is to engage with different stakeholders and ensure uh, they have cooler city, less noise pollution, access to nature, and overall better health. So the key idea behind Cities for Forest is it's politically led. So the mayors of the different cities are the key leaders or the key people who will bolster this action. So that's why the panel in the later in the day is going to have these mayors who are on the Cities for Forest platform to kind of promote and give that political kind of voice and importance to nature-based solutions. So I will stop here, and thank you very much for listening to me. And I would move on to introducing the panelists now, and then open up the floor for discussion. Um, uh, Thank you very much again, I would call upon Mr. Ashok Jain. So he's a co-promoter and managing director of Terracon. So it's an NBS company, and it's also an EIA consultancy firm. And he has a humongous experience in environment, financial services, and agri-businesses. He helps urban local bodies to kind of engage and promote biodiversity at large. And then we have Ms. Olga. She's the founder of Unicity, and she's also a climate change disaster risk management specialist, and also deals with climate vulnerability assessment. She works with ADB, UNSCAP, and UNIDO. And her main approach is to impart cultural integrity and bring in the aspect of culture and natural assets as the core of urban development. Then we have Ms. Sucharita Roy. She's head planning AKDN, and she's an urban development planner and regional planner. And she focuses on visioning, research, collaboration, and advocacy, and including sustainable urban development in her work. Then we have Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh. So he's he's a natural resource economist and econometrician, and he heads the Observer Research Foundation from Kolkata, and he works across across themes of inclusive growth and SDGs across different cross-cutting centers within ORF. And he's the member of expert committee for formulating scientific policy guidelines for cutting trees for development projects. So he has many publications to his credit. Plus Dr. Rajan. So he works very closely with us in Kochi. So he is the director of Center for Heritage Environment and Development, and he supports multiple activities for the Kochi Municipal Corporation, and he has vast experience in bringing environment, economics, and sustainable development together. So thank you very much. I will start with questions, and I think I'll just take a breather and then start with questions to all of you. So. So I would just start with saying that we have different action plans in India. So the National Action Plan on Climate Change has multiple missions, and again, these multiple missions also work in silos. So the often the mission for Clean India does not really resonate with the mission on knowledge on climate change. So everything works in silos, even within the missions that we have promoted. Similarly, we have the Smart City mission that focuses on water supply, preserving open spaces, sanitation. But again, this is very specific to addressing certain gaps in city, and it's never holistic. So, looking at examples, we had really wonderful examples in India, but there are some really great examples across the globe that we have that we can learn from. So, one of them is the Rain City strategy in Vancouver, Canada, which includes numerous components of biospheres, rain gardens, these smaller interventions that I was talking about, into engineering a more absorbent landscape within Vancouver itself. So these are probably some of the examples that really we should look to integrating and institutionalizing within our city. So having said that, I would move to Ms. Olga first and ask her about how important and how imperative it is to include NBS in cities for understanding climate, for understanding combating climate risks. And what is her thought on and what needs to be pushed in cities to ensure that this is happening, the imperativeness of NBS.
Thank you very much, Priya. It's a real pleasure to be part of this panel because it's an extremely important topic. We at Unicity work with Asian cities, a lot with India, but also other Asian countries, which are very much at the forefront of climate change. And for me, NBS are great because not only they address climate change, but they generate a number of other co-benefits for cities, which is not happening when you only tackle things with engineering solutions. But maybe to start with an example that I really find striking, and I think it really illustrates the effectiveness of nature-based solutions well. It is the example of Singapore, not so much in terms of the institutional setup and resources, which of course we can't compare to developing Asian countries, but just in terms of technical effectiveness. To give you this specific example, so Singapore, of course, is a hot and humid climate, and it lived through the climate change effects as much as many other cities in Asia, with over 1 degree of temperature warming over the last 40 years. The annual rainfall increased by 500 millimeters over the last 30 years, and sea level rise also happened by 0.5 centimeter. So all these parameters are there, but yet at the same time, Singapore now has only about 30 hectares of flood-prone areas, which got reduced by 10 times compared to 30 years ago. So while climate change effects are going up, the city's impact of climate change is going down. Same goes with temperature. If you compare with Bangkok, which actually is a little more pleasant temperature-wise, but actually your experience within the city in Singapore is much more pleasant because of the lush greenery. So this is to make one very important point that yes, nature-based solutions work. And why nature-based solutions? Because Singapore is very much focused on this concept of city and the garden. They keep increasing green and blue areas in the city while population is also rising. So another illustration of the fact that it is possible. So here we've established that technically it is possible to be extremely effective. Now, another point that I already touched upon it a little bit in the beginning, very important for developing in smaller Asian cities and Indian cities, which have a very limited financial resources. And there are a lot of priorities. So climate change, reviving natural assets is just one of them. But there are a lot of priorities. There is poverty, there is education, there is infrastructure to be set up. So you want to be very wise with using the resources you have. And if you want to invest into something, it has to generate not just one outcome, but as many outcomes as possible. So now say you have a flooded area and you just put pumping stations in it. So it pumps water somewhere else, it reduces your flood level there, but that's as much as you get. Not to mention that you may be flooding the neighboring area. Now, if instead you revive a park, a lake, which is able to absorb that excess of water, you can also use this park to bring people in to enjoy it. You can improve the air quality. There are all these number of benefits that line up. And also, there are a number of studies that have been done by UN agencies, by international development institutions, showing that actually nature-based solutions are quite cost-effective as well. So if you have to make an investment, you definitely want to consider. Even more interestingly, I'll give you the example of Surabaya in Indonesia. So the mayor was very interested in planning because she's an architect. She was an architect by education. So essentially what she did, she revived 7 parks throughout the city, which she interconnected. And that reduced dramatically floods, but at the same time, it created a real social cohesion. So before she started this, Surabaya was actually a problematic city crime-wise. People were not connecting, there were areas of different income level. So these parks were placed in such a manner that people from different social categories could come and interact, which also created a very positive social effect. So I think this is a very important idea to retain, that we want to target as many benefits as possible with one intervention. Now the real question is, how do we actually do it? And so here at Unicity, we are a think tank at the same time as we are a consultancy. And we actually did a thorough study a couple of years ago on the benefits of including protection of natural ecosystems into city planning. So instead of waiting until you reach the project level where investments are engaged, you want to see what is it that you can do with just protecting from encroachment, from redevelopment, natural areas that you already have in the city. And that master plans, city development plans are extremely effective. Now, another issue is that this is not institutionalized as such, and maybe later, I don't want to monopolize the time, but maybe later I'll come back into how we can institutionalize, and I would have a couple of examples to share. But I think this is something, this tool is very much underused, and it can really create wonders. And maybe just to conclude, in addition to this, what we always want to see is, say you have a challenge. So I think climate change, I speak about climate change not only because at Unicity we focus on it, but I think it's a great entry point for nature-based solutions. You start seeing what are your climate problems, and then you look at nature-based solutions that generate other benefits, and it really works great. So whenever such an issue has to be addressed, one would always want to see where a natural asset can come into the picture. And this is not the mindset we have. Also because, as you rightly mentioned in your presentation, so we have the different engineering departments, then the planning department is somewhere else. If we have someone responsible for climate, they may not be part of the dialogue either, so we don't consider that option. But actually, if we made it systematic to see, okay, what are the natural assets around, how possibly we can revive them, what would be the cost, what is the comparative cost of the engineering solution, what is the final win-win situation, I think we would already bring the nature-based solutions into the picture quite strongly. So maybe that much for now, but I'll be happy to share more ideas.
Thank you very much, Olga. So, in short, I think just a holistic approach to integrate the importance of natural ecosystem already without having to wait for a plan or something to come up in the future. I think so. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. I would move on to Mr. Ashok Jain. And it would be really nice if you could share, what support you provide to cities, and in this NBS model. How do you ensure the cities engage, and for the long-term sustenance of this NBS model that Olga just mentioned about integrating natural resource ecosystem into the existing city? What is your organization? What is it that you're doing to ensure some level of sustenance in what we do?
Sure. Thank you very much, Priya, and warm welcome to all the co-panelists. So I think you broadly covered a lot of things that comprises the NBS, and that's a wonderful stuff. But what we have been doing as an organization that has been working with urban local bodies now for almost 12 years. We started off with what we call as tree census, or inventorizing trees for cities. And this is over a period of time has moved from doing a manual census to a completely digital process, whereby you don't use any paper, and we end up organizing trees, map them on a system that we have prepared, proprietary software, and you can do all the kinds of analytics. What has that has actually helped us in many ways. It's possible for us to calculate carbon sequestration straight away using tree as a unit, as well as a region, as a cluster. It's possible for us to work out what is the impact that a particular green zone is having on its region with respect to carbon mitigation. The second is obviously the green cover. We are able to put together the data for ward-wise green cover, city-wise green cover, and the total overall coverage of the cities with respect to the green ratio, and also compare it, because we normally have a ward-wise population data. We compare it with the population. So we are able to kind of figure out how many trees are there for, say, one person, how many trees are there at the city, and benchmark it maybe with multiple cities that we have in India as well as outside India. And there are certain benchmarks which are available. So this has actually helped us in preparing even urban forestry plan for cities, because we then go down to absolute micro level, either ward level, or even a smaller constituency level planning for cities. Either it's for the particular corporator or any such micro unit. This helps us to aggregate the data at multiple regional levels and put it together and see it at a city level or an urban region level. Now, when it comes to obviously a completely city level, the scenario completely changes, because now you're looking at the aggregate set of data and trying to relate it with the city. What we have been successful is in convincing some of these cities that it's not just the tree data which is relevant, but if we have to really take the city to the next level in terms of NBS or organizing NBS, or even working out or making sure that the biodiversity and ecosystem services are maintained, are enhanced over a period of time, they need to do a concerted planning, which actually means mainstreaming biodiversity and NBS into the planning process, which I think Olga did refer to in her conversation. So what there is a tool that we are using. We are trying to convince many cities to actually collect baseline data or organize data in a format which is very well prescribed. So I think the National Parks Board of Singapore has prepared an index called City Biodiversity Index. So since last 5 years, we have been calculating this index for 4 or 5 cities that we have been working with. And this actually gives us a complete compilation and strengths and weaknesses of each city with respect to native biodiversity, with respect to ecosystems, ecosystem services, and it even goes beyond the biodiversity and talks about how the administration and the governance structure is with respect to each city when it comes to managing the city's green assets, green infrastructure. Moving forward, what we have tried to do is to leverage this data. As I think in your presentation, you have referred to that it's a data-driven process. So using the same CBI process, City Biodiversity Index and indices, that using that data, we have coaxed many of the cities to actually go ahead and plan or prepare a document, what we call it as LBSAP, Local Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. This document, tries to lay down the strategy and also components, break that strategy into various components and action plans to make sure that you are able to consolidate on the strengths that the city has with respect to biodiversity and nature and natural ecosystems, but also address the weaknesses of the city, the challenges of the city with respect to biodiversity, and try and enhance it, improve it, restore some of the ecosystems. So this is how the cities can probably try and mainstream the biodiversity. So we don't try and tell them that you have to do this, but we actually make sure that the development plan that every city has, and we bring out each of these components and try and overlay the biodiversity, which I think has in your presentation also you referred to. So we try and overlay the biodiversity considerations in the city development plan. So how this helps us is obviously leads to reduced resistance from the city administrators, because development plan is something that they actually have to stick to. They don't make an exception. Unfortunately, in India, when we try to see some of these development plans of some of the cities that we have actually worked with, we found that there is hardly any biodiversity consideration. The only consideration that many of these development plans have is actually an open spaces or open areas policy, that you have these kind of plots which are reserved as open spaces without having any idea as to how to develop these open spaces, whether they need to be converted into mini urban forests, or they need to develop gardens or recreation places, which species to be planted. So this is that big disconnect, that in spite of mainstreaming the biodiversity, I think there is still disconnect between having a very short-term plan and having a long-term vision for the city. So through the LBSAP process, what we are trying to inculcate in the city administration is to actually have a mission and have a vision for the city in terms of green cover, in terms of species planning, because ultimately, I think all the species. What about how do you deal with mature trees? Right, you need to systematically replace some of these mature trees over a period of time, so that you are able to play with the species composition. You're able to play with biodiversity in a more constructive way for the cities. So this is the journey for us over the last 10 years, and I think it has been a fantastic journey for us to deal with city administration, convincing them, inculcating the spirit of creating a vision for the city. And I think we are all now talking about NBS since the last couple of years, which is really a good news for people like us or companies like us.
Thank you very much, Mr. James. So I think you really highlighted some valuable points, especially on integrating and mainstreaming biodiversity into existing action plans. I think cities need to really capitalize on the local biodiversity strategy action plan and make it more robust and inclusive, so that it can be used for some of these spatial planning processes. And your thoughts on open spaces, for example, I think cities really don't know what they have to do with open spaces. So and promoting NBS again, I think just reiterating for everyone. So we really do want to promote urban greenery, but we really want to look into something more holistic. For example, wetlands, anything that would provide that co-benefit and service. I think needs to be promoted. So I think the local biodiversity strategy action plan in that way would highlight what are the strengths and assets, natural resources assets that the city has. So that could be like a great lead for having and mainstreaming NBS into the cities. So moving on from here and taking cue from what we just discussed, I would ask Dr. Ghosh. So we are aware about the importance and benefits of what NBS, what the importance and the benefit that NBS provides, and we also know some of these existing action plans. But most often than not, the cities do not really find deep value in nature-based solutions as such. Because the initial cost of setting up is a different thing, but what is it that they get in terms of economic returns to having this NBS on ground? So this is something in a way that contradicts with their passion or vision to incorporate NBS. Sometimes we see this when we speak to cities. how do you think, and this aligns well, again, this in a way works well for them, because it's never the budgetary allocation in a city never is inclusive of nature-based solutions. So there's never enough resources. So how do you convince them to have this as an important thing, and show them the value, like Mr. James said, having the tree census, giving them the carbon sequestration potential. These are just indicators for them that we show as research and think tanks. But how do you actually ensure some of these finances are, we convince the city to have NBS, and the cost of it and the importance of it in economic terms as well. So the environment part we are able to convince, but to operationalize it, we have to also convince them for the other part.
Thank you, Priya, for this question. I think it's an extremely important question. One thing is for sure that the physical capital that we bring in by replacing the natural capital is simply not adequate, because there is scant understanding, in fact, in this part of the world, that nature-based solutions are organic and integral components of the broader natural ecosystem. So rather, flood mitigation mechanisms, say through embankments, have actually aggravated floods. In fact, aggravated the flood damages in Bihar floodplains, where historically they put floods to optimum use. And floods are also integral components of the ecohydrological cycle. And you will note that, in fact, this came out only this week or last week in a recent note in Down to Earth. The GIS maps clearly showed something very interesting, that the important roles that wetlands played as the flood sink. In fact, the spaces in Bihar where there are wetlands, only there you find the flood waters being accumulated, and all other spaces are comparatively, of course, are comparatively much better off. Now, in many cities, as we know, that disappearance of wetlands, the cases of Chennai, Thiruvananthapuram, or even in Kolkata, the disappearance of wetlands have been responsible for essentially creating such severe floods. Now, one very critical element that we need to look at is from the perspective of the ecosystem services, and eventually the kind of values that they create for us. The cities need to be looked at as part of a broader landscape, and it depends a lot on the broader landscape ecosystem. So if one really looks at what essentially the ecosystem services on which the life and livelihoods in the cities are dependent on, it's very clear. It can actually be classified in terms of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment classifications. That is clearly the provisioning service, suppose say the drinking water provided by wetlands, or maybe suppose if you're a city like Kolkata on the riverbanks of the Hooghly, then in fact it comes from the rivers, it might come from the ponds, might come from the lakes, water for agriculture, then fisheries that thrive essentially in and around wetlands, fuel, wood, fodder. Then you have the critical regulating services of the ecosystem in terms of the air pollution control, climate and microclimate regulation, of course, carbon sequestration, as has already been mentioned, water conservation and purification, which is happening organically, flood regulation, moderation of extreme events, then pests regulation. Then apart from that, we have the various cultural services in terms of the cultural and the spiritual values, tourism, the very greenery, inspiration for folklore, architecture, etc. And in the process, what it also creates is some kind of a social capital. Now, apart from these three forms of ecosystem services, I mean, this NBS apparently also provides what we call the supporting services, which essentially is supporting all these three ecosystem services. This is in the form of gene pool protection, or say in the form of primary production, or in the form of say soil formation or something like that. Now, if you look at, say, how essentially we need to look at these values, now one very important component is essentially to bring in front of whether it's the general public or the policymakers. This is an instrument that is being increasingly used in the developed world, as also in the developing world, as also in India. That is the valuation of the ecosystem services. Monetary values of such services, in fact, helps in creating some kind of of recognition or the acknowledgement that the ecosystem should value. It creates an objective basis for decision making across multiple options by removing the existing ambiguity and arbitrary value judgment, helps rationalize preferences from the various available options. Secondly, such monetary values actually create a much stronger scientific and quantitative basis for channelizing efforts and investments for conservation goals, acknowledging the criticality of the trade-off between conservation and development. Thirdly, the valuation exercises help the policymakers in making allocation and distribution decisions while attempting to maximize the net social welfare. And a comprehensive valuation exercise can actually help in reconciling between the social goals that might otherwise appear contradictory. Fourthly, these values can also guide legal proceedings for determining damages where a party is held liable for the loss to another party. In fact, this offers a mechanism for strengthening the hands of the judicial system. Fifthly, which is extremely important in the context of cities, it can help in designing efficient management mechanisms like economic instruments, controls, and also, in fact, development of institutions. Very complicated and difficult to develop institutions like payment for ecosystem services. But if they can be developed, they can essentially lead to very powerful solutions, just as in the case of the Catskill watershed, which is essentially where the local community is incentivized by the municipal corporation of the city of New York to essentially maintain and govern the watershed so that the drinking water and the urban water services are provided in a sustainable manner to the burgeoning population of the city. So incentive schemes negotiated between two ecosystem service users can lead to a win-win situation in addition to enhanced ecosystem health and sustainable utilization of natural resources. And sixthly, this was a concern that was mentioned earlier, that what about the investment decisions? Suppose, say, often we think of physical capital and physical infrastructure interventions as a replacement for the natural capital. Now, investment decisions on public goods and utilities, say, if it's a linear infrastructure in many developing nations, which previous speaker just mentioned about, often ignore the adverse effects or impacts of environment, because this entire ecological cost is not considered in the cost-benefit metrics. Now, the ecological cost in the long run might turn out to be large enough to exceed the apparent economic benefits. So, valuation of the ecosystem services actually can bring this to the fore. Let me also give you an example, because how nature-based solutions, in fact, we all talk about, because a very recent WWF report has talked about the employment generation capacity of NBS, and it puts across a value of 1.2 billion employment generation in terms of the sector, in terms of the farm sector, fisheries, and some other also related to tourism. Over the last 3-4 years, I have been harping on a particular index known as the Ecosystem Dependency Index. This is essentially the ecosystem dependency of this index measures the ecosystem dependency of a community, of a local community in and around a particular ecosystem. This might be around an urban wetland, or might be around, suppose, lakes, or might be around a forest ecosystem, or whatever. Now, they extract certain services from the ecosystem. In one of the evaluation exercises that I conducted, in fact, in a microecosystem, that is the Kunigal wetlands, I found that this index, this ratio, which is essentially the ratio of the values of the ecosystem services and the income of the community, this ratio was 1.25. That means the community is extracting 25% more from the ecosystem than what they are earning from the economy. So this is something, this brings in the critical equity concern when we talk about nature-based solutions. Now, given the high costs for retrofitting or for creating or retrofitting such nature-based solutions or blue-green infrastructure, which we often talk of, cities often need to raise money or suppose, say, in some way or the other, create sources of finance. Now, if you look at the European Union, in a very recent document, it classifies the financing possibilities under two heads. One is that you implement the NBS projects or maintain the NBS maintain existing NBS directly, especially on the municipality owned land. And in such situations, the municipality pays for the intervention either through funds it already has or by obtaining loans and revenues to finance the project. And the second option is to encourage other actors. For example, it might be residents, utilities, businesses. They can implement the NBS, especially on their private property, or to contribute to the maintenance of their existing NBS in the public domain. There are, of course, various instruments which are being used in the first category, that is innovative use of public budgets. Suppose, say, pulling funds from different other government departments, grant funding or donations, then in fact using user fees, instruments which can generate revenues, say value capture mechanisms which have been used out there. Then you, of course, have the green finance or the various debt instruments, that is loans from public or private financial institutions like green bonds, and which is something that is very popular out there. In fact, in Europe, that is the natural capital financing facility. Now, there are, of course, the second category essentially talks about the market-based instruments, and as also, in fact, institutions like user charges, subsidies, institutions like the payment for ecosystem services, which in largely has not really, I mean, the stories of failure are much greater than the stories of success. There is no doubt about that. Now, the values that you get are too many. So how do we, in fact, in a developing world or the Indian context, incentivize the creation of natural capital or disincentivize the destruction of already existing NBS? Now, certain instruments are in vogue, but not in the context of the urban spaces, possibly. Just as the very first measure, first instrument that is often being used when physical infrastructure comes in the way of the natural capital in many spaces, especially by the forest department, is compensatory afforestation. And this is not really, has not really been an easy issue, and this has also often been criticized, because often the afforestation, suppose say you create some kind of a physical infrastructure or a linear infrastructure like roads, which is going through, may or may not go through a protected area, but might go through some space which belongs to the forest department. And often the afforestation, the compensatory afforestation has been conducted at a space, but the primary beneficiaries are not located. So in the process, though the community has been enjoying this resource for years, you simply create something else, physical capital out of it by destroying the resource, but you are compensating for the afforestation in some other location where the community is no more benefited through the provision of the provisioning services or through the regulating services. So of course, this again entails another mechanism which has been discussed lately, that in fact, in many of the meetings that we are holding, that land for land. But where is that land? Can we have that land in this particular space where the community is located, or how do we essentially compensate the community for the loss that they have incurred in the process? The other way of dealing with essentially such retrofitting or creating some funding mechanism for NBS, if in case that gets lost, is through what we call the NPV funds. This is existing in India, net present value. The net present value, this represents the aggregation of the stream of ecosystem benefits from the ecosystem services minus the costs, discounted with a rate of discount so as to reflect the net value of the stream of ecosystem services that one can get over the next few years in terms of the present period. Now, in the context of any ecosystem, in the context of forest, these benefits are the ecosystem services provided from the forest. In the context of an ecosystem, this can be the ecosystem services provided by the ecosystem, and the costs involved are the costs of accessing or obtaining them. Now, this is essentially the fund that the forest department obtains from developers as costs of lost ecosystem services, and they take into consideration the next 20 years. What would have been the value that the ecosystem would have provided to the community for the next 20 years. So that has to be paid by the developer themselves. The assumption in here is that as if the landscape or the ecosystem will be able to regenerate itself in the next 2 decades and provide the same kind of ecosystem services as it did earlier. And this has, of course, come under a lot of criticism. And right now, and more importantly, when this entire funding mechanism is being made, it is just a transfer from one department of the government to the other department. So the the face of the community is lost in the process. The human face in the entire scheme of things, the ultimate losers are not there. But what it does is, if now that there is there are talks that it cannot be 20 years, rather it should be the rotation period of the species which should be taken into consideration, which might make it 50 years of compensation. So this is something that will increase the entire cost and will definitely come in the way of deterring the developers or infrastructure developers to get into physical infrastructure by destroying the nature or causing losses to the ecosystem services in the process. Because one thing is very clear, that there are higher costs that are being incurred through the losses at times, in most of the times, than the gains that are obtained through the development of physical capital. So this equation, once put into the entire cost benefit analysis across space and time, EIA is not sufficient. Let me put this very straight. This is absolutely slipshod, absolutely half-baked. We have to get into a separate kind of an equation. And with this number, possibly you can come across with a better incentive or disincentive mechanism, A, and 2, you can simply play with the funds, if at all that is collected, in terms of funding the nature-based solutions. So I'm not going to get into something that is alien or something foreign in nature, or in terms of complicated financial instruments that you really have to think, really have to convince communities, and at times then in fact you invite a host of speculators to play in the market. But let us try to play with something that is already in vogue, maybe from a different context to the urban context. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, that about talking about multiple things on equity and about using these instruments like NPV, and also on how to bring in innovative other mechanisms of innovative financial measuring ecosystem services and other the other services that the ecosystem provides, and also on the landscape that it has in terms of considering who gets more, and your example on how the earnings from the ecosystem, actually the invisible earning is higher for communities than their own economic earnings. So these are some really good examples. But for the interest of time now, I would hurry to Ms. Sucharita and ask her about her experience on how they did integrate NBS on ground, especially in low-income neighborhoods, because this is something when Dr. Ghosh talked about equity. So I was just thinking, so NBS is something that we really need to have an inclusive approach right now and not specific to certain communities. So it would be great if you could share some insight examples on your experience on working on ground with communities, integrating NBS into their neighborhood scale or in the city scale. So over to you. Thanks.
Yeah. So the first thing that I would like to say is, when you engage with communities, you have to engage with them as equal partners. You can't go and direct them what to do and how to do and think that they would take it up. And this is particular with urban communities because of the transitioning nature, because of the very fast lives they have. They are often a little detached and have very, very probing questions to ask when you want to go and engage with them. So this is something that we learned, and we learned that when engaging with the community, you start from the point where you initiate the project. You don't come to the end of the project and then come to the community and say, now implement or something like that. You start with the initiation. So you initiate with them, you plan with them, you implement with them, and you engage them in the monitoring and evaluation. And finally, when closing, you also engage with them in an intensive manner. The interesting thing about NBS is, NBS is something that can be very decentralized implementation, very decentralized products that get created, which can, and decentralized ownerships that can be left behind. And that is one of the opportunities in NBS and engaging with the communities. As I said, equal partners, empower them, bridge the gap between scientific studies and communities. There's a huge gap that generally gets developed by bringing data in the public domain that helps in bridging the gap in a big way. And once you've bridged the gap, you've engaged with them, initiate very careful stakeholder mapping. And I'll see why stakeholder mapping, we take this as a very big term in our NGO sector, working with the communities, is that it's just not the person who's living there, or there are those local leaders who have a lot of influence. There are those local mafia leaders who have a lot of influence, political influence, the electoral leaders from the constituency who have a very strong influence. It's very important to map the stakeholders, because one of the tools of community engagement is creating citizen observatories. And citizen observatory doesn't mean only well-doers or volunteers or such. You need to engage with all these stakeholders. You should know who will participate, how will they participate, and what would their roles and responsibilities be. And if that is mapped very carefully in the initiation stage, that helps. And this is also a process of communicating your intent, communicating and creating an awareness around what is being intended here. And that helps in engaging with the communities quite a bit. After you have engaged and mobilized the community, the next thing is that you define the needs with them. So citizen observatories again come and have a big role to play here. One of the examples that we had is we were looking at flood mitigation in a very micro ward kind of a level, and we engaged with all these people that I mentioned, the shop wallas who are seeing this flooding happening on the streets every day, the community householders who are facing this every day. We had local mafia because there were slums, and there are these mafia leaders who are also the rescuers and the community disaster response team, because they engage with the community there and they establish their businesses there. So they are very important. We mobilized them and such, and then we went around as doing the micro level assessments with them, the citizen observatory. So what happens is, here you are already creating an ownership. You are as to generating the ideas, some that are prompted, some that come from them, because I am considering them the equal partner. They are actually traditionally holders of a lot of knowledge, sometimes which we miss out, simple solutions that we miss out. So once you engage with them and engage with them as equal partners, FGDs, sitting down with them, stakeholder facilitations, they help. They really do help in grounding the work that we do. I'll take a case example, we were working on a very large scale housing project for cool roof applications and urban heat mitigation demonstration to see how it works in large, affordable housing sections. So it was not only the housing society that we engaged with, we also engaged with some of the strong members of that society who may not be part of the managing committee. We engaged with them on a continual basis, explained to them what we were planning to do. We brought the vendor on board and made him present before the stakeholder to convince them that this is the plan and this is what is being planned and this is the capacity of the agency and this is what they will bring. We also established the roles. What does the housing society do in this process? What does the vendor do in this process? And what does ACA as a technical agency do in this process? Defined it clearly, established the timelines, because timelines is very important. Again, a person needs to know how long are they engaging in this process. You communicate upfront all these things. And then we initiated the work. And there was a research agency also involved in this process, because we wanted to make it into a demonstration project, have research for advocacy purposes, for scale up. So all these people have to come on board at the same time. This is how the planning is done. But for the plan, you need to engage with them all. And during the planning, you also need to know how, where to build capacities. People are receptive. We have, done assessments of settlements with volunteers by building simple tools using ICT and technology, and then, building the capacities. This has not only helped us in initiating and mobilizing the community, it has helped in planning, because you get a lot of ideas, they engage with you. And by building this capacity, they are owners of the process. Some of the other things that in terms of solar and renewable energy, this is very important, building capacities of how do you, when you move out, how do you leave behind the asset? If they don't know the operation and maintenance, you have not established the guidelines, you have not told them what kind of performance benchmarks to look at, they wouldn't know how to take care of it, right? So these kind of capacity buildings are very, very critical. I would say demonstration is a great tool. Citizen observatory creation is a great tool. Then you go ahead with your direct implementation or your implementation with stakeholders. NBS gives you the provision or the opportunity to actually go in for implementation with stakeholders. Now let me just take one more case of how we have gone about a plantation. So we went about identifying some of these volunteers and turning them into cadres and getting them involved into a floristic research. We were actually looking at invasive species and the change in the vegetation cover in a certain area, which was an eco-sensitive zone. So we got them involved in a floristic research where we were continuously doing the screening, identification of species. We realized that the people on the other side know much better what has happened. You have these sections of senior citizens who have the historical perspectives of what were the kind of trees, new introductions, what kind of cropping patterns have changed, and what are the changes that they have seen over their lives. You capture those anecdotes, you capture the people, you make them go out in the field, map them, use ICT tools and technologies to collect that data and bring it back to the researcher who is working with us to identify what changes have happened at which timelines, and that has resulted in a certain change in the flora and fauna. So this is another thing that has worked well with us, where we have engaged from the beginning till the end. And the last bit that I would like to say is handover is a very critical part in this community engagement. You need to clearly set out whose roles, what kind of performance benchmarks, what kind of guidelines, any kind of advisories that you can help them with, and then only withdraw, but keep in touch at a regular interval. That is what we get to do as civil society. We stay in touch with the communities and keep inquiring, establish that line of communication so that they can come back with their technical queries and we can resolve them. Yes, Priya.
Thank you, Mr. Chilta. Sorry, I'm not able to really sum up those wonderful points that you raised, but just working together with the community is something you reiterated multiple times. I would move on to Dr. Rajan. So, Dr. Rajan, as a city representative and as someone who has been working in Kochi for very long, just trying to understand what step is Kochi taking towards now nature-based solutions and these multiple potentials that we highlighted on integrating the local biodiversity strategy action plan, the climate action plan, etc. So what and these cells, the biodiversity cell, disaster management cell. So in the current momentum that we have in Kochi on where NBS is kind of a priority, how do you think this is going to become operationalized on ground, and what are the steps the city is taking? Sorry, I'm just having to sum up multiple things together for you right now due to the paucity of time. I'm really sorry, Dr. Rajan, but your thoughts on whatever I said.
Priya, thank you very much. And actually, it was a learning experience for me. Ashok, Olga, Sucharita, and Dr. Ghosh, all of them been giving me kind of insights as what to do in Kochi. And hearing them speak, I think we haven't done much. So, and Kochi as a city grew without any proper development or master plan for the last 7 to 8 decades. And in all these years of unplanned growth, we thoroughly ignored nature-based solutions. That was there very much. Actually, nature-based solution has been there always, but we always ignored that and never made use of it. For instance, we could have kind of prevented the depletion of groundwater and saline intrusion into the groundwater by planting a lot of mangroves. It was a traditional knowledge, and everyone knew it. We never applied that, and now we are facing a lot of shortage of water. Our groundwater is completely contaminated, and salinity is there, and that is the whole thing as far as nature-based solution is concerned in Kochi's case. And likewise, we could have kind of adopted many more nature-based solutions to address our issues. What really happened was that in these 8 decades of unplanned development, we lost all critical aspects of living. Like I always say this, like water, air, soil, food, and on top of all of this, livability. And now we have nature-based solution as a concept and a clear implementation strategy before us. And that is what I've learned from all these four learned people, experts in the field, that we have a concept very clear, a theoretical framework and an implementation strategy. And how are we going to kind of make use of this nature-based solution in addressing the issues of Kochi? And we are now preparing a master plan, and it is in a draft format. And certainly actually in yesterday's meeting, our chief town planner was there. He referred about this. We will try to bring in this aspect of nature-based solution more into it. And we are also developing a communication strategy, engaging the people and the policymakers to get more acceptance to nature-based solutions. I think it is very, very important in our democratic process to engage the community, and that's what Priya began with. See, we'll have to get the community as well as the policymakers understand what is nature-based solution, and how we are going to do it, how it's going to really benefit us in our programs and projects. And adopting nature-based solutions would really need some investment. For instance, like making Kochi, we are one of the solar cities, and implementation of NBS solutions, for instance, making Kochi a solar city, will need a lot of initial investment. And where do we really get funding for that? And I think we'll have to explore all that aspects. And then also we'll have to create awareness and build capacities of local government, the Kochi Municipal Corporation, to kind of implement nature-based solution. It's there very much in our traditional knowledge, in our system, in our mindset, but like somehow we kind of jettison during our this process of unplanned kind of development. Research, development, and cooperation at a different level among institutions is actually happening. That is how the World Resource Institute is working in Kochi, and you are doing the Cities for Forest project. There are like Interact Bio project. There are so many projects happening, and we need to really integrate all these projects and programs into our development plans, in our master plans, and in the development paradigm. Actually, we really need to kind of reinvent all that we lost in the process, and apply that into our development process. I think that is what I go to say here, and I don't want to go more into it because we are in short of time, and I know Priya is requesting for more and more time. But anyway, we are going to work together. And these are the certainly like we will take all this knowledge shared by our expert panelists, and apply that in Kochi with the support of WRI and other like-minded organizations. Thank you, Priya.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rajan. I think you made it amply clear that for the city to kind of really have a climate proofing the city is really important, and nothing better than NBS actually at this point in time would help. So again, really sorry for the rushed panel, but I would just get back to Olga for just maybe in a way summing up and providing us a few takeaways on what cities really need to do to operationalize NBS on ground. Some key takeaways. Olga, over to you. Thank you.
Valuable insights. So I don't think I'm the one who should summarize because points were very clear, but maybe what I'll do is to bring three perspectives, international, national, and city, on what is it that we can add to support implementation and spreading of nature-based solutions. So at the national level, I think national level is critically important, especially for big countries with many cities like India. When there is a national direction, it supports cities in many ways. We saw it with the 100 Smart Cities scheme, where cities just applied massively. There was a structure how to do it. And here I want to give the example of the Philippines, which is one of the few developing Asian countries which really nailed down the system, where the National Climate Change National Climate Change Commission cooperated very closely with the Housing and Land Use Regulatory Board, and they developed guidelines on how to mainstream climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction into cities' land use plans, and specifically comprehensive land use plans. So now it is compulsory. Every city, every 5 years, has to revise these plans and has to make sure that land use reflects these matters. And that very much comes to ecosystem-based adaptation, because this is what you typically do with land use. So in a country which is very federal, which is the same for India, where a mayor's tenure is only 3 years, this offers great stability. So I think it's an example that in India we would possibly want to delve a little more into and see how at the central level, the environment, the climate entities can better cooperate with the urban entities to create something and mainstream it. Now coming to the city level, I think a centralized entity which carries out the climate change issues, the nature approaches is very important. I worked with the city of Surat a few years ago, which was one of the pioneers because it was part of the ACCRN network that later became 100 Resilient Cities. And what I liked in this city, what really propelled them forward, was that they had a centralized entity that was responsible for climate change, Surat Climate Change Trust. So this entity was placed within the municipality, and I believe it is still in place. So very much interacting with engineers, very much interacting with planners, but also with health departments. So really having that kind of holistic view and action. And this trust is not only governmental, but it brings together different stakeholders. For example, the private sector is very active, and that allows the private sector to identify opportunities that are also financially beneficial. For example, water was quite expensive for industries. So they identified that they actually, if they treat themselves a certain wastewater, they will pay less than if they just buy regular water from the government. So it's a win-win situation. And such win-win situations can be identified when people can sit across a table. So this trust actually was able to do that. And finally, I feel there is great value in cooperation platforms, something that WRI is doing, for example, bringing cities together within one country, but also across countries. South-South cooperation is very important because I gave the technical example of Singapore, but then, of course, the institutional setup is not comparable to what happened in India. But then India could benefit maybe from some learnings like Philippines. The Philippines could benefit from some learnings from India. So I believe these platforms which bring cities together and allows them to learn from each other and motivates them and shows them that things are possible, that shows how they're possible, at this point is extremely beneficial as well.
Thank you very much, Olga. I think it would be really nice if I could get back to all of you again to discuss on this, but definitely I think beyond this panel, we're just going to reach out to you individually and work a little bit more on this, and also ensure that whatever we spoke today and the operationalization aspect and the long-term preparedness for cities that we want to bring in, I think we are already thinking about it. So I think with our collective efforts, it would be really great if we can just actually put these words into action on ground. I would stop here and thank you very much. And I know that all of you have not been able to say as much as you can because of a paucity of time, but we will definitely get back to you. And thank you, each and every one of you, for being on this panel again. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. And I want to just say something like it was a great learning experience, and you chose one of the best panelists. And for a city like Kochi, it's going to be really beneficial, and we are going to kind of take all this learning into the implementation stage. So thank you for that. Thank you
very much, Dr. Raj. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Priya. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.